Part 3, Confronting Obstacles to Addressing the Crisis. Despite his critique of the centering of capitalism in accounting for the unfolding climate catastrophe, Chakrabarty is willing to admit that capitalism is at least part of the problem. And as we've seen with Moore, Waksal, and Vergès, there is a considerable scholarly contingent willing to elaborate a rather sophisticated narrative about the intricate connections, indeed mutual interdependence, among dynamics of class, gender, and racial domination on the one hand, and the domination of humans over nature on the other. These scholars are not operating in a vacuum. Indeed, as Dorothy Guerrero, the head of policy and advocacy at the UK-based organization Global Justice Now, argues in her chapter, The Limits of Capitalist Solutions to the Climate Crisis, published in 2018 in a volume edited by Vishwar Satkar on the climate crisis, South Africa and global democratic eco-socialist alternatives, quote, there is an increasing acceptance that capitalism is directly connected with climate change and that the apocalyptic consequences of it are already causing deaths, diseases, dislocations, and destruction to ecology and people's lives. Moreover, these nefarious consequences are bound to continue so long as there remains no decisive measure being taken to address the climate crisis. According to Guerrero, it is important to understand the extent of structural dependence on a fundamentally extractive and ultimately collectively suicidal relations. She emphasizes in particular that the extraction of fossil fuels, oil, coal, natural gas, which is the biggest cause of climate change, is what enables large-scale production of food, of goods, transportation systems, and efficient distribution networks of products and services. She also highlights the fact that modern wars in the last 3 decades, as exemplified by the invasion of Iraq, were at least partially about access to and control of the production and distribution of oil. And yet, and this is the point of her intervention that is perhaps most worth noting, as the impacts of climate change intensify, free market ideology, big business, and financial actors increasingly shape the strategies and priorities in addressing it. Again and again, Guerrero stresses the ubiquity of corporate capture of attempts to address the climate crisis, as well as the systematic exclusion and marginalization of the voices of those most negatively affected by the climate crisis from climate negotiations. Guerrero begins by pointing out that despite the inclusion of climate change in policies after the historic 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro that gave birth to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, in 1994, and after more than 2 decades of meetings, the total global anthropogenic greenhouse gas, GHG emissions, which cause climate change, have continued to increase. According to Guerrero, it should by now be obvious that the climate negotiations are not generating appropriate solutions that match the scale of the crisis. Among the reasons for this, she insists, is the fact that the countries that are most affected by climate change, but have contributed the least to it, have very little say to influence climate politics due to the asymmetry of political and negotiating power between the global north and the global south. Or she puts the point elsewhere, global warming most threatens the poor and the unborn, the two constituencies with little or no voice in governance. At the same time, crucially, parties to the UNFCCC do not acknowledge that the capitalist economic model they espouse and rely on is based on plunder, waste, and pollution. Guerrero stresses how successive rounds of climate negotiations have set the trend for consolidating new markets and investment opportunities for big business in the name of climate solutions. These business-oriented and market-controlled climate policies and mechanisms differ widely from the just and unsustainable solutions needed by the people on the planet. She laments that the challenges to democracy and development in general are increasing due to the corporate capture of UN climate processes and other policy arenas. From negotiating for binding commitments, she contends, the UNFCCC capitulated to the corporate agenda of voluntary pledges and market-based initiatives that will do more harm than good to the environment and the global climate system. In effect, these negotiations allow business as usual and create corporate profits in the name of combating climate change. As such, she insists, neoliberal capitalism has fundamentally shaped global responses to climate change, and she highlights the need to challenge the entrenched power of many corporations, the culture of energy use, and global inequalities in energy consumption. Easier said than done. Not only are current regulations woefully inadequate, they are being actively undermined. Very powerful actors such as the WTO, the international financial institutions, IFIs, transnational corporations, and other agents of neoliberal capitalism are in fact moving to eliminate environmental policies defined as barriers to trade and to prevent governments from discriminating against polluting products through bilateral and multilateral trade negotiations. Meanwhile, powerful corporations, through their lobbyists, have consistently influenced climate negotiations. In a word, Guerrero insists, climate change will not be solved through negotiations dominated by corporate interests. The governments that are supposed to lead in climate change solutions are also the ones pushing corporate trade deals. Trade deals that will benefit the fracking industry and support big agribusiness companies that undermine the ability of farmers to adapt to climate change, as well as various free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties. So this is what we are up against. Not only is the global capitalist political economy the driving force underpinning the unfolding climate catastrophe, but also well-entrenched vested capitalist interests are working systematically to actively undermine or otherwise co-opt attempts to address the problem. What is to be done? Given the urgency of the situation, it is well worth paying some close attention to debates about tactics and strategy for mitigating the climate catastrophe from within capitalism, even as we might wish to struggle to transcend it as part of a transitional agenda, so to speak. To this end, there has been a quite interesting, albeit decidedly Eurocentric, ongoing debate in the pages of the New Left Review over the past couple of years, of which Lola Seaton provides a useful overview of contending proposals in her article, Green Questions. She begins by comparing several contributions to the debate in relation to the different answers they provide to the question, what does the world need to cut in order to avoid global disaster? On the one side, there is Troy Vettis's eco-austere answer, which takes land scarcity as the fundamental metric for an alternative green political economy and insists that we must reduce our energy consumption and cut out meat and dairy. On the other side, there is Robert Pollin, who takes issue with Vettis's fundamental metric. He thinks Vettis's estimates about how much land renewable energy systems would require are inflated. With land scarcity not a limiting factor in Pollin's account, cutting our energy consumption beyond reducing energy wastage becomes unnecessary. According to Seaton, Pollin is almost exclusively concerned with reducing not energy use, but fossil fuel use. In the middle, there's Herman Daly, who thinks we need to reduce our use of resources, including but not limited to fossil fuels, and to limit population growth. To implement these reductions, he envisions some kind of cap and trade system. In the case of resources, there would be a limit on the right to deplete what you own, and that right would be purchasable by auctions from the government. Then there are Mark Burton and Peter Somerville, who agree with Pollin's emphasis on the switch to renewables, but disagree with respect to the level of economic sacrifice that such a switch would entail. Seaton points out that whereas Pollin is wary about the political and economic viability of massively shrinking the economy, which he fears could result in a green Great Depression, featuring impossibly high unemployment and unacceptable drops in living standards, Burton and Somerville argue that a drastic contraction of the material size of the economy through cutting industrial production, construction, agriculture, and distribution is the essential complement to a switch to renewables. Seaton notes that Pollin's answer stands out from the rest because his version of the transition to clean energy would mostly not be felt by individual consumers, whose energy use, unaffected by the change of provenance in quantitative terms, could continue as normal. In her words, the question of sacrifice in Pollin's text is largely out of frame. As such, Pollin's solution would release us from significantly altering our lifestyles and call for little curtailment of individual freedom. Seaton continues, Vettis's solutions, by contrast, deprive everyone of meat and require many people in the world to use a lot less energy, especially Americans, who would have to reduce their energy consumption by more than 80%. Seaton argues that Daly's proposals provide something of a bridge between Pollin's technology-enabled unlimited consumption and Vettis's non-optional austerity. His steady-state cap and trade system would combine aggregate control over the total amount of carbon we collectively emit or the total number of children born with as much personal autonomy as is compatible with such macro restrictions. Nevertheless, in Seaton's judgment, Pollin's proposal has a kind of prima facie plausibility that the others lack. She reasons, intuitively, one suspects that the consumption habits of American citizens, whether meat eating or car driving, would be tough to crack. Moreover, she contends, Pollin's exclusion of sacrifice also appeals because it speaks to the skepticism some feel about the efficacy of small-scale individual efforts to reduce humankind's ecological footprint, while at the same time, his program is attractive from certain angles on account of its narrow focus too. Seaton is, in a word, persuaded by Paulin's political realism, abetted by a sense of urgency. To this end, she quotes him approvingly as insisting, "We do not have the luxury to waste time on huge global efforts fighting for unattainable goals." Political strategy, Seaton contends, calls for attempts to identify what kinds of political obstacles sit in the way of implementing those technical solutions at the required speed and with the necessary thoroughness, with a view to asking how those obstacles might be overcome. It requires us to map the route between how things are and how things ought to be. The problem with the more ambitious proposals requiring greater levels of sacrifice, according to Seaton, is that they risk political irrelevance, since we are left without any meaningful sense of how they would come to seem necessary to the people in a position to implement them. For that matter, Paulin too, she notes, fails to specify how the intergovernmental global bureaucracy his investment plan presumably requires would obtain enough political clout to override the interests of the fossil fuel industries. One of the key features that distinguishes Paulin's proposal is his commitment to continued growth. Seaton points out that a particularly contentious point of the debate was provoked by the affirmation by Benjamin Kunkel, who wrote that fidelity to GDP amounts to the religion of the modern world. Others responded that not growth, but maximizing profit for business in order to deliver maximum incomes and wealth for the rich is what drives the capitalist system. Yet, as Burton and Somerville stress, growth is, at the very least, an influential cultural notion, and they go on to make the point that the GDP imaginary also influences electoral politics. Indeed, as Seaton puts the point, the sine qua non of electoral viability, growth, is thus not just a self-activating outcome of capitalism's drive for profit, but the ideological cornerstone of its social legitimacy. In this vein, she makes reference to Michael Mann's pithy formulations. GDP growth is why capitalism is seen as a great success story, whereas political success is actually measured by economic growth. For his part, Daly counters that the connection between profit and welfare, a connection institutionalized by GDP, hardly holds. And furthermore, in such a vein, Seaton quotes Robert Brenner, who has argued that over the past decades, under neoliberalism, as growth has slowed, so has people's belief in it. Burton and Somerville criticized Paulin's proposal, with its attachment to growth, for being allegedly guilty of misidentification of the villains, his blaming financialized neoliberalism and thus the stagnation of growth rather than growth itself. They claim that this is what allows him to make ecological proposals that operate essentially within mitigated capitalism. Seaton continues, whereas Daly's eco-friendly capitalism is small scale and stationary, under Paulin's Green New Deal, a bigger economy may be better. This is a key difference. She furthermore points out that there are two connected reasons Paulin remains committed to growth. First, he regards it as politically non-negotiable, and correspondingly, his central objection to degrowth is to its immediate effect, huge job losses and declining living standards for working people and the poor. But is Paulin's embrace of green growth within a mitigated capitalism in its own way a case of wishful thinking? Or as Seaton poses the question, is capitalism capable of ecological self-healing? Or does it, as well as fossil-fueled growth, need to be jettisoned if the planet is to remain habitable? Here Seaton returns to the work of Michael Mann, who in the fourth volume of his Sources of Social Power has identified three fundamental social actors of our time, whom he thinks are responsible for climate change: capitalism, nation states, and individual consumers. For Mann, one of the key problems is systemic short-termism, the other nation-statism. According to Mann, short-termism characterizes the thinking of both politicians, beholden to the rhythm of election cycles, and the capitalist classes, bound to the profit-making imperative, whilst the nation-state remains the fundamental political and jurisdictional unit, and the performance of the national economy the overriding political priority. In terms of the problem of nation-statism, as Seaton puts the point, any viable green strategy would require the existence of a global intergovernmental body with genuine legislative capabilities and practical powers of implementation. However, and this is crucial, the geopolitical arrangements capitalism enshrines are what is preventing us from taking necessary action to save the planet. Ultimately, for Seaton, it is the problem of how to overcome economic and ecological unevenness and how to compel high-consuming countries to accept sacrifices on behalf of the safety and sustainability of low-consuming countries that is so intractable. Yet, as Mann writes, though eco-socialist arguments are morally valid, morality does not rule the world. Seaton goes on to quote the Marxist literary critic Frederick Jameson's claim that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. This may be true, Seaton contends, but she goes on to ask, but can it be shown that we need to attempt the latter, the hardly imaginable, in order to prevent the former, the easily imaginable, from befalling us in reality? She continues, does pursuing the unimaginable or advocating the impossible paradoxically have a greater chance of affecting change at the magnitude and speed required? Here she quotes the social historian Mike Davis, according to whom it can be reasonable and prudent to make overambitious, unrealistic demands. Just because it is so drastic, it illuminates what is indispensable and essential. In a nod to the notion of utopian realism, Seaton appeals to Davis's lucid perception that reality, the all too real prospect of global disaster, has become, so to speak, unrealistic. Conclusion. Let us on this utopian realist point conclude. In this lecture, we have focused on the relation between capitalism and climate catastrophe. To this end, we have considered in some depth the world ecology paradigm as articulated by Jason Moore. We have also incorporated a feminist complement to the paradigm as provided by Johanna Oksala, as well as a decolonial critical race complement to the paradigm as elaborated by Francois Vergès. We have then considered a partial rejoinder to the centering of capitalism in accounting for climate catastrophe as articulated by the eminent post-colonial theorist Dipesh Chakrabarty. We have concluded with the treatment of the systemic obstacles to addressing the climate crisis within capitalism as laid out by Dorothy Guerrero, and with an overview of debates about what is to be done by Lola Seaton. That we shall conclude.